Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the French Revolver Modele 1892, a handgun that was long ago the second we covered for this show. But we've learned so much more since then, so let's go ahead and get this guy in the light box again. Weighing in at 1.8 pounds and with an overall length resting just about at 9 3/8 of an inch, this blued beauty has its original luster. The right-hand gate rolls back to free a surprising swing-out cylinder, accepting 6 rounds of 8mm ordnance ammunition, often called 8mm lapel, which never gets confusing. The action is triple in nature, both single and double. Now I'm happy to say that today's episode is once again made possible in part by support from my favorite CLP, Ballistol. Last time we talked about how Ballistol had been of great aid in caring for both German firearms and German soldiers during the Great War. But I've since found out that the same product might have been true for the US as well, if not for the fact that the war interfered. It is said, though I haven't confirmed, that a Philadelphia corporation forwarded a sample of Ballistol to the Springfield Armory in 1913. By April of 1914, Ordnance was now aware that this German oil was superior to the Cosmoline in use at the time. The would-be US supplier was encouraged to submit on the next request for proposal. However, the outbreak of war consumed their supply for the foreseeable. Guess it was needed at home. Thankfully, we can all get plenty of Ballistol in any market we choose today. And as has always been the case, the bulk of the funding for our efforts once again has come from viewers like yourself who have chosen to support us for between $1 and $5 a month over at Patreon or Player, where you'll get access to our little podcast and, if you're a high roller, a monthly historical document. Hint hint, this month's is super cool. Now, this show is a remake of an ancient and frankly poor quality episode of the primer series. In the original, I struggled with the limited reference material and especially with a poor understanding of the evolution of revolver lockworks. Not to mention, strangely, a very short timeline at that point. That's a story for our podcast one day. Today, however, my repeated frustrations with conflicting claims from just about every author out there has resulted in taking on a massive project to truly understand who did what in wheelgun technology first. The project, by the way, is administered by our volunteer Alpha Golf and organized on our publicly available Discord server. While it's still incomplete and I have some notable concerns, we're now solidly ahead of just about every reference book printed up until today. So, what I'm about to tell you is much better than before, but not necessarily a finished body of work. That caveat in place, where the heck did this thing come from? Well, the shortest possible answer is France, who in 1870 had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of what had really just properly become Germany. France's War of National Defense had made martial pride something felt all the way down to the individual citizen. The rivalry between the two powers wouldn't just be long-lasting, it may also have become the template for total war. All this is to say that in terms of military technology, neither Germany nor France wanted to be too far behind the other. So it's no surprise that France would be an early adopter of the triple-action centerfire military revolver, taking on the Chamelot Delvine in 1873. This was a ruggedized form evolved from a series of Belgian designs marketed to Switzerland by the brothers Pirlot. While the Swiss started it off with rimfire, the French, and immediately after the Italians, would adopt the same in centerfire. Unfortunately, the French 1873 cartridge was fairly weak. It used black powder to push a relatively light 11mm lead bullet rather leisurely towards the enemy. This presented no strain on the massive, solid-framed Chamelot Delvine. At the time, this was hardly a concern, for the first few years at least, as Germany still had not adopted a centerfire revolver of their own at all, nor had France's other major competitor, the British Empire. In fact, both had been so incredibly slow to pursue handgun technology that the French could really hardly lose out no matter what they picked. Germany would ultimately adopt the Reichsrevolver, an obsolescent single action of massive size. However, it did use a more reasonable cartridge, their own adaptation of .44 Smith & Wesson Russian. Britain would take another year to finally adopt an army revolver. The Enfield Mark I was, on paper, actually quite advanced. Unfortunately, the execution didn't fare as well in real-world service. Its cartridge, commonly known today as .476 Enfield, although that's a bit of a side story unto itself, was also more powerful than even Germany's. Just to drive it home, here we have the original French 1873 alongside its competitors. Lighter, yes, but also much slower. This was of course a problem with the cartridge, not the revolver design as a whole. As a matter of fact, the French Navy would adopt the Chamelot Delvine with a slightly different chambering. And in 1890, the Army would update their cartridges to scoot along a fair bit faster, though not as ideal as you'd like. However, once doubts started to appear at all, it became apparent that the Chamelot was not an advanced design. For starters, it was too heavy overall for the amount of firepower that it returned. Averaging 1.1 kilograms or 2.5 pounds, this was nearly the same weight as the massive and complicated British Enfield. While the French were still happy with its rugged, solid frame design, the lockwork was proving complicated and delicate. And you know what? I suppose I should probably show you what I mean by that. Alright, we have a French 1873 Chamelot Delvine with the side plate off and left grip removed. Now, this is of course a single, and pull the trigger, boom, and double action revolver. I'm going to ride that hammer so it falls. Do yourself a favor, if you have a side plate gun, the pins actually need the support of the side plate. Don't dry snap a side plate gun with the side plate off. You're really going to do some damage one of these days. So, what was the problem with this particular action? Well, complexity. Almost nothing is doubled up. We have a trigger, we have a hammer, we have a sear, we have a strut to communicate between the hammer and the trigger, we have a hand to power the cylinder. Some of these are necessary, but as we'll find out, some of these are actually mechanically unnecessary if you do good design. Now, some of the things they did try to combine. Well, we have our own hammer spring, own trigger spring, own sear spring. There is a combination spring that serves both the hand and the strut. We also have a cylinder stop that's integrated into the trigger, so that's at least a little efficient. However, because that's integrated in the trigger when the trigger is back, there is no locking bolt or stop to prevent out of battery rotation. And if you notice, there's our second problem right there. You see me trying to roll the cylinder and something's stopping it. What could it be? The worst thing possible. It's the firing pin, because there is no automatic rebound in this system. You must manually catch that sear in that position in order for it to roll over. So that means you have a lot of risk of not only potential accidents and having this ease down on a live primer, but you also have the potential accidents of somebody not knowing better, opening the gate and then smashing the crap out of the hammer trying to roll the cylinder around, which I've seen a lot of in these old manually rebounding revolvers after a century of people tinkering with them. It's very common to see damaged firing pin tips. So overall, not an ideal scenario. By the mid-1880s, it was clear that France would eventually need a new sidearm, something not quite like this. So tentative research was begun. However, unlike previous designs, this next one wouldn't be simply purchased from the commercial market, or even really modified off of one particular model like the Chamelot Delvine was done. France was going to go the same route as the British. They wanted this to be run by a military program through and through, taking good ideas and putting them together. It would be headed by the Section Technique de l'Artillerie, which I probably didn't pronounce well, as all Frenchmen remind me. By 1885, they had already had a suggestion. This revolver, known as the Model 1885, is sadly something of a mystery, as the research that went into its assembly was likely entirely within the STA. However, by examining the known trials pieces, we can make some assumptions. Let's start by looking under its attached swing-open side plate. Everything I've read on the French 1885 prototype says that they were derived from the Swiss Model 1882 revolver. As we'll see, this will be somewhat true of our 1892 design today, but not so much the early 1885. Thanks to all of our revolver research, I can now comfortably say that the most likely origin for the lockwork on the French 1885 trials revolver was both Belgian and British-ish. I'll hopefully explain some of this with the help of, well, actually, a Danish revolver. This is a Danish 1880-85. Now, the only real difference between this and the original is the length of the cylinder and therefore the length of the cartridge inside. The Danish 1880 is just about the only pure Fonyu that was ever militarily adopted. Even so, it's not perfect because it doesn't use a Fonyu gate. It does, however, use some other distinctive features like his weird hammer and his takedown system, in which we just pivot that around and we flip this guy open. This isn't a video on this revolver as a whole. As a matter of fact, this is just a video on its lockwork. Let's get a closer look. Now, Fonyu lockworks are fairly simple. That was the whole point. As a matter of fact, in terms of what's going on in here, the really new novel thing to his work is the fact that this arm also rebounds the hammer. Its existence came before him and is often credited to Hubert Comblain. So how does this particular lockwork function? Well, in order to show it properly, I'm going to need to pop a couple pieces out first. Stripping everything down to just the trigger and the hammer, we have a relationship between the two, a design that is often credited to Marryat. That's because of Rolf Muller, a researcher who is unfortunately deceased, and sadly I've been unable to track down the patent or other document by which he claims Marryat as the originator. However, I'm going to trust him for the moment until I can prove it out. Now, this arrangement has a hammer nose that is spring-loaded, which existed before Marryat, and it has a direct action extension from the hammer to the trigger. Again, that is a very early feature of revolver and firearms technology, just trigger attached straight to hammer, sure. This arrangement, however, allows us to eliminate having another sear, something over here. Our sear interaction is direct instead of being floated off to the side. Now, this provides us with a single and double action lockwork, which means that, and I'm gonna have to provide some tension because there's no springs right now, that I got them out of your way. If we cock the hammer back, let me roll that cylinder so that, there we go. Sorry, cylinder was just a bit in our way. If we cock that hammer back, eventually it's going to snag right there, and it's almost hiding up under the frame, but that little kiss. If there's any forward pressure on the hammer, if there's any forward pressure on the hammer, there we go, and the trigger is not allowed to go back as it's under its own spring tension, then the hammer can't fall. The minute we touch that trigger though, boom, nice crisp single action. For double action in a system like this, when we pull the trigger, an extension, the same extension off the trigger, is going to strike the underside of the nose. It's going to push that hammer back until it clears. Once it clears, the spring pressure on the hammer would have had this drop. Boom, we keep going a bit, no problem. When we release the trigger, the nose, which is spring loaded, compresses and then snaps back to position, assuming that I have everything out of my way. There we go. Still leaving the mainspring out for a moment, this armature here is supposedly the creation of Hubert Comblain. Again, I have not had a chance to actually prove that out. Certain patents have been elusive in the Belgian archives, but we'll give him credit for now until we learn otherwise. What the arm does is it allows us to take the pressure of the lower section of the mainspring, so our mainspring would be here pressing on the arm. It allows us to direct it around the hammer into the hand, which then is pressed into the trigger. That means that by pressing down on this, the hand is cut to bias slightly that way, keeping it in contact with the cylinder. Remember, this is essentially ratchet tooth. We need it to do what it's doing. Now, whenever we pull through with that pressure, again, my own cylinder's in my way, there we go. Pull through, hammer comes crashing down. The hand is kept in bias the whole time. I'm putting the pressure myself without the spring. When we release the trigger, that same spring pressure is going to be driven through the hand into the trigger, and it's going to push that trigger back down. That means we need no independent trigger spring, that problem child that kept breaking on the 1873. The one addition that Fonyu adds, the big claim to fame, is this shelf right here, combined with this extension off the hammer. Now, he had the idea as an independent part years before, but integrating it into what we're going to nominally call a Marryat Comblain lockwork, although both of those need proved out, integrating into this made for a very safe and a very functional revolver in terms of having an auto rebound at almost no additional expense. Now, you can even, if you look closely with that verdigris there and with this little line there, see that this is actually two parts that have been stitched together. A lot of later designs would have it made out of one spring component, but you get the idea. It's not that hard to construct, and yet for the cost of no extra parts, no extra springs, you get to automatically rebound that hammer. So this is going to come in contact with that extension. We'll be able to see that by firing the revolver, hammer go down, and then if I press on this, hammer comes back automatically. That's fantastic. Now, this, of course, is a lockwork that was used for just about every revolver from the mid-1890s after, and a great many in the 1880s, as we're already talking about. But the French 1885 wasn't satisfied with just this. They actually added two additional components. The first of those we saw in our British Enfield revolver episode, although it was applied to a Warnant lockwork. A derivative of the Fanyu, Warnant's patent also rebounds the hammer, but it makes two additional simplifications. One is that the rebounding lever is integrated into the lower arm of the mainspring. The second is that the hand, which rotates the cylinder, also serves to cock the hammer back when using double action fire. There's no need for an independent sprung nose. These features were all used by the British, who added just one extra bit. Figure E in this patent from Michael Kaufman shows an extra component attached to the hammer's axis pin, meant to transfer the spring pressure from the lower mainspring arm into the hand at a better angle and smoothing out the action by reducing overall travel and therefore friction. While the patent was claimed by Kaufman, the development of this concept is actually hotly contested. Kaufman further refined the design in 1880. This adaptation can be found in the Webley-Kaufman top brake revolvers. So if you combine the Fanyu system with the Kaufman smoothing arm, you get the French 1885's core lockwork, though the 1885 also includes a cylinder bolt, which prevents rotation when the gun is at rest. This actually appears to be inspired by the Swiss 1878, using raised dimples into which a projection on the front of the trigger locks. They also borrowed a hammer block safety of sorts, at least for when you're loading the gun up. That I can show you more clearly with this Portuguese Abadie. Alright, we've got an Abadie. Now some of you might be very eagle-eyed and recognize this as a later model, but it doesn't matter. The lockwork is the same, and that's what we're talking about. Coming from our Chamelot Delvine, we've made one fairly interesting mechanical change, which has to do with how this thing works. You see, we no longer have the strut attached to the trigger, we have it attached to the hammer, and that's very important. So for double action on this pistol, you pull the trigger, and again, I want to support this because I don't want to, let me get that over. I want to support this because it's got the side plate off, but as the trigger is pulled, we push an extension up into the nose, it pushes past the nose, and then, woo, slip, crash, fall. And as we come back, the nose compresses into a flat spring. Compress, compress, compress until it snaps over, ready for double action again. This is a critical function because the way it is arranged in this gun, we can disable it when we open the loading gate. So let me flip that over. There's our loading gate. I'm going to just open it like this in a second. You saw that hammer come back. Let's see what that does mechanically. If we have fired the gun, boom. This is again a manual rebounder. The hammer is down until we cock back and this notch catches in the sear. But if we open the gate, look what's going to happen. A couple things at once. Boom, it rebounded itself before you can even really see what's going on. And if I keep opening the gate, you might be able to make out this little half round right there. This stud is attached to the gate. It's a half round that's being turned into the path of the hammer nose. And once it's in place, it compresses the hammer nose, cocks the hammer back to the rebounded position, which means no more firing pin accidents when you're loading and unloading. And then it also disengages the double action for this particular revolver, which means that we can now index to each of the chambers and therefore quickly load or unload the pistol without activating the hammer and without setting off the firearm. This is both a speed loading and unloading system and a safety system. And it also helps prevent wear on that firing pin by people who don't know any better. It's actually quite brilliant. Being a gate loader, the 1885 was equipped with an ejector rod. This was done on the Perrin system. Notably, this is not the fixed rod found on the Swiss Warnants. At this time, it was still found on the Belgian large-frame Nagants. The ejector rests inside the cylinder arbor, also locking it in place. The ejector can be withdrawn and then rotated over to deal with any spent cases. Now, unique to the French pistol is a sort of finger rest behind the trigger guard, meant to provide a more comfortable grip. The new revolver took the same old anemic 11mm cartridge. Initial testing really didn't seem to get underway before the program was suddenly accelerated, thanks to the collision of innovation and determination. The former was the development of smokeless gunpowder, which had been discovered in 1884 by Paul-Marie Eugene Villiers thanks to his invention of techniques and instrumentation to better analyze gunpowder. Villiers' poudre bee was a technological breakthrough that would put France well ahead of her military adversaries. However, it needed to be exploited quickly. At least that was the opinion of Georges Ernest Jean-Marie Boulanger, charismatic war hero who had served in conflicts from 1856 through the Franco-Prussian War, often taking a bullet or two in the process. It's said that with a wounded right arm, Boulanger was lifted onto his horse and took the reins in his teeth to lead a charge against the Germans. In 1880, he became the youngest general in France, and in 1886, he was appointed to Minister of War, a role that he took to with fervor that often frustrated allies and enemies alike. In firearms history, he's most notable for rushing the development of a small-bore, smokeless cartridge rifle for the French army. The result would be what we know as the Lebel 1886, which startled the world in 1887 and was nearly obsolete in 1889. That's because in a rush to complete the cartridge, French ordnance would leap right past various other emerging technologies associated with magazines, quick loading, gas mitigation, barrel harmonics, and the like. Now, I mentioned the deficiencies of the Lebel because, as we'll see, our revolver today benefits to a degree from a few extra years in the oven. Now, while Minister of War Boulanger was whipping along the development of a small-bore rifle, he also came to learn of the 1885 Trials revolver. Taking office in January of 1886, he already had a letter out in May asking the STA to design a small-bore adaptation of the same. He even wrote his expectation that 50,000 should be completed by January of 1889. That same year, production of the 1873 Chamelot Delvine was halted, never to be restarted. So, as of that moment, the clock began ticking. During 1886, the STA would design and issue samples of two revolvers, an 11mm variety, seemingly identical to the 1885 Trials revolvers, and I suspect these are often confused for each other in certain articles, and a scaled-down 8mm version, samples of which were sent to the Boucher Powder magazine in Paris and to Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, for both the creation of a standard cartridge and to prepare for the expected mass production of a rushed prototype kind of like the Lebel rifle. Given that the 11mm prototypes used the standard cartridge, they could go on into trials immediately. These began in September of 1886, using several examples with minor variations in lockwork, grip angle, etc. Dimensional changes and a handful of features either included or withheld in order to get the best possible tweaks right at the front. The conclusion? Well, it was slightly lighter, simpler in construction, easier to maintain, it was more convenient to load and even unload, and for certain examples, the grip was preferred over the 1873. However, it suffered from misfires and often jammed up with black powder residue, though this was likely due to tighter tolerances between the cylinder face and the rear of the barrel, which were kept close due to expectations around smokeless powder being used. The most notable problem appears to have been a failure to return the trigger, again likely due to fouling, so a stronger spring was recommended going forward. Some felt the hammer safety was borderline dangerous, but I don't know if they meant the auto rebound or the Abadie gate in this case. Overall, it was considered superior to the old 1873. Adoption was out of the question though, because the small bore was in the works and expected to be the real future. Development on that front was wrapped up at the end of 1886. The initial cartridge was basically an upscale of the Swiss 7.5mm. Still using black powder, it featured a simple lead bullet and paper patch. The powder load was apparently the same as the Swiss. Really, the only big change was the diameter, which was chosen to match the new Lebel rifle cartridge. Now, matching your bore size between your rifles and your pistols was a way to share barrel components and maybe even tooling, though the initial trials revolvers used a different rifling pattern from the long guns. Testing the new 8mm prototypes would, of course, compare them to the old 1873, but it's likely that the French felt it would be best to put it against one of its more contemporary competitors. So, in December of 1886, the military attaché in Bern ordered up 10 samples of the Swiss 1882, along with 3,000 7.5mm cartridges. These were split up between the STA, the Trials Commission, and the École Normale de Tir at Chalon. In February of 1887, the comparative tests were undertaken, and while the two pistols were similar enough, there were some slight differences noted. Overall, the French trials piece was felt to be easier to manipulate, and had a more comfortable double-action operation. Some felt that it was actually too smooth and therefore dangerous. The 8mm cartridge provided slightly better accuracy and penetration than the 7.5, but the 8mm bullets had been secured with a simple crimp, which had a tendency to fail, causing the bullets to shake loose and jam up the revolver's action. The Swiss used a superior knurled crimp. And finally, there were still reservations about the Abadie gate. I haven't seen the primary document, but from my reading, I would guess that there were fears that a gate left open or knocked open slightly would disable the firearm in an emergency. Overall, the new 8mm prototype was viewed favorably, but with such a radical change come some deep concerns. From what I can piece together, these are the rough metrics for that 8mm cartridge, at the time still loaded with black powder. The bullet was now 120 grains, moving incredibly slowly at 623 feet per second. Not a lot of power. Like nearly all armies at the time, the French thought a handgun round should be able to stop a horse, so an auxiliary test was performed the same month, something like a miniature Thompson-Lagarde test, although long before that. 2 mares were dispatched with the old 11mm and the new 8mm. Neither of those cartridges could accomplish the task, but the 8mm was judged to be better than the 11, slightly, for reasons. Artillery Captain Dessalot, notable for his later development of France's 1898 Spitzer rifle bullet, reported that the 8mm cartridge would be easier to improve in terms of both speed and the hardness of the bullet than the 11mm. So, it's okay that it doesn't work. It really wasn't okay. But Momentum and the top brass were really into 8mm at the time. It's also worth mentioning that at about this same time, an outside competitor was introduced. The Fanu revolver, as marketed by Maguire, rather successfully, I might add, probably because compared to the 1873 it was simpler, lighter, and still being produced. This revolver embodies the very lockwork that had found its way into the STA prototypes. It was summarily ignored. That's likely because there was no time to consider anything other than implementing the new 8mm concept. The decision was made in April of 1887 to order 1,000 revolvers and 200,000 cartridges. Though of course, once again, minor changes will appear. Shortly after the 1,000 unit order, the rush was over. Boulanger had, in his short reign, instituted a number of reforms and greatly improved matters for the French soldier. But he had also purposely agitated Germany, almost daring them into another war. When his associated administration was voted out in May of 1887, the incoming prime minister sacked him immediately. Ordnance could now slow down and think a little more on what exactly they were doing. Too late for the Lebel, but just in time for what would become this little guy. It's amazing to think what would have happened if they hadn't taken the foot off the accelerator. So, Moss wouldn't present the first 10 serial production revolvers until January of 1888. Minor changes were considered, and the matter putted along until the end of August, when the first case of 60 Model 1887 revolvers were delivered to the STA. Thankfully, we finally have some original drawings. Still, the same overall lockwork and sporting a dovetail front sight bead-like in shape. These were among the shortest-lived military revolvers of all time, because they were immediately returned for modification in order to include a new mechanical feature: a frame-mounted firing pin. Unfortunately, they weren't actually designed or manufactured for this feature, so a sleeve had to be fitted as well in order to make it work. Once approved, this modification was done to all 60 plus the pieces to be produced. Now, originally 1,000 units were ordered, and I'm unsure if every single one was actually produced because only 792 went out for direct trials. Factor in a few more for the commission, various schools, and ammunition manufacturers, and you're still missing roughly 100 pistols. Were these documented poorly or never produced? I don't know. Regardless, they were finished in January of 1889 and put out to trials in February with the cavalry, cuirassiers, dragoons, chasseurs, artillery, and gendarmerie. 3 months later, the amalgamated reports had one unanimous conclusion: they weren't ready. The cartridge was considered the major issue. It suffered from poor penetration, poor accuracy, it frequently misfired, and, likely thanks to the ad hoc firing pin, suffered a lot of pierced primers, which tended to hold on to said firing pin and tie up the action. The pistols were issued in the white, like the old 1873, polished steel, but many felt that bluing should be standard, like every other army. Some also doubted the grip, both in form and in the use of wood instead of the Swiss ebonite. In September of 1889, it was decided to suspend the production orders. Final adoption of the 1887 was not approved, and the work on a new design continued. From the notes that I have available, it appears that the next bump in development would come under the leadership of Jules Francis Joseph Barré. Educated at the École Polytechnique, Barré had been a career artilleryman, eventually joining the small arms section and rising to Chef d'Escadron in the STA in 1888. It's worth noting that he'd go on to be director of Châtellerault in 1896, but for now, we're still in 1889, and by October, the STA had produced a modified pattern of 8mm revolver. The finger rest was deleted, the arbor was modified, the ejector shortened up, the front sight replaced, and the rear of the frame was changed in shape so that the firing pin could be struck at a better angle. The new 1889s were produced with various rifling patterns and slight differences in chambering. The big decision was whether to go with a cartridge presented by the Vincennes Cartridge Factory or the Central School of Pyrotechnics in Bourget. Vincennes provided a tapered design. Bourget, however, used a sort of bulbous-shouldered thing. In limited trials, the Bourget would actually win and became the basis for the final pattern. Various lead and jacketed bullet types were also considered. In the end, the limited trials marked out several decisions. A lead paper-patched bullet, the cartridge rims were not recessed inside the cylinder, and that the revolver would use identical rifling to the 8mm Lebel rifles. It was accurate enough and allowed use of the same rifling tools and would mean that otherwise disqualified barrel stock might be recovered for handgun use if necessary. The resulting Modele 1890 also used a heavier hammer, changed over to a pinned front sight, and added yet another component to the Fanu lockwork: a pivoting arm on the lower mainspring arm, which acted on the original pivoting arm that was added between the hammer and the hand. Oh my god, I'm running out of words for these things. I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually know what this was trying to solve. I can't seem to align it to any of the prior complaints. It does, however, seem to further reduce friction and travel between these components. It may also help stack pressure at the right moment in firing. Don't have one to play with. Now at this point, the STA might have been satisfied if not for their exposure to a newly adopted small bore revolver all the way across the ocean. That would be the Colt 1889, otherwise known as the New Navy. Let's see what this does that's so unique. This is actually a pure example. Wish I had it back when we did our episode on these. Now, this gun has a unique trick, which is that despite being a solid frame, in other words, much better than a top break where the hinges might wear and break and the parts become all fiddly, no, this is very robust, and yet we can, kick out our cylinder and eject all 6 casings at once and quickly reload whatever we might need to reload and then close her right back up. Now, I know this seems silly to film because almost all modern revolvers work this way. Anybody that owns a television is used to how this goes, let alone somebody that's handled really any .38 in the modern world. But don't forget, at the time, this was the first military revolver to actually do this. And so you have to give credit to the French to say, hey, why can't we implement something like that? Now, this technology wasn't new. It had been patented all the way back in 1869. However, Colt's execution proved that it could be made simple, rugged, and reliable. Unlike the Colt New Navy, the French had a cavalry focus and wanted to keep the doctrine of placing your pistol in your left hand along with the reins of your horse while you use your right hand for loading and unloading, fine manipulation. So they would actually flip the mechanism to pop out the other way. This, plus a decision to use a different release, spawned a little micro-series of trials revolvers. These are commonly called the Model 92 a pump, thanks to the unusual combination latch and ejector head, although the earliest prototype retained the Abity gate, which meant that the hammer could still be disconnected for loading. This first pattern also sported a half-moon front sight like the Colt, and a large externally visible flat spring on the left side, which was meant to keep tension on the crane arm, preventing it from flopping around whenever you had the action open. 5 were tested in August of 1891, and 50 were ordered in October. These were finished and sent out for testing with the Hussars, Dragoons, Artillery, and for assessment at the Versailles Artillery School. Their reports were compiled in January of 1892. They were found to be much better than the 1873, but there were still some complaints. Disassembly could be easier. The double action was stiff. The front sight wasn't well loved. Frequent shooting would cause fouling, which could prevent the cylinder from being closed back into the gun properly. Meanwhile, however, the pressure to adopt any revolver was growing. Don't forget, the 1873 left production 5 years ago. So even as the reports were coming in, changes were being made. Let's get it going, guys. The first of which appears to have been an example that moved that big crane bias spring inside the front of the frame, which also allowed the hinge to be moved all the way to the end of the frame. This, of course, wasn't enough. More had to be done. The final push of changes are largely credited to Saint-Étienne's controller, Jean Richard, and his assistant, Captain Nicolas. Richard, however, had worked at Masse since 1874, specifically starting as a hand fitter for the old 1873 revolver, eventually rising to a second-class controller in 1889 and a first class in 1893, likely as a result of his efforts in this story. From the outside, these changes appear quite tame. We've inherited the improved cylinder crane and the internal resistance spring. The big change is the lack of a loading gate, which means that the mechanism also lacks the Abity lockout. To release the cylinder, you now just pull forward on the ejector rod cap and then swing out. Now, all this was done because the previous models were considered too complicated and particularly expensive to manufacture, both in terms of cost and time. The same concerns saw a need to reduce the number of parts in the lockwork itself, so the inside would be changed as well. Oh yeah, we're almost back where we started, the Fonyu lockwork, plus a little bit extra. The lower mainspring arm now serves the role of the previous rebound lever, a nod to the Warnant. The Kaufman arm is gone, as is the extra hinged lever, but the need to reduce friction remained. An easier solution was found by adding a roller inside the hand on which the mainspring extension rides. The mainspring itself also received a roller on its upper arm. This replaced the hammer stirrup while preserving smooth operation. 2 versions of this revolver were produced, one with the frame-mounted firing pin and one with a traditional fixed hammer pin. Still, there were problems, the biggest of which was that pump assembly. The pull-to-release, push-to-eject concept was too delicate. Also, ditching the Abity meant that there was no mechanism to prevent the hammer from being dropped on an almost closed cylinder. So the gate and Abity were returned to the system, the ejector assembly was simplified, and the pin front sight was restored. The decision was made to keep the firing pin on the hammer, but it was now hinged. Basically, they adopted this. With limited trials on June 1st of 1892, this became the official revolver of the French army. Sort of. An initial order of 5,000 was placed, but as it was being filled, there would be some fine-tuning. The changes are minuscule, but one does stand out. It wasn't until March of 1893 that universal bluing of the revolvers was finally approved. With that in mind, we can finally take a look at the French 1892 in detail. Whew, there we go. A beautiful wheel gun. Actually, the finish on this is terrific. This is how they would have looked back in the day. Now, before we get too far into it, let's see where we came from, because this is the old 73, and I think you guys can pick up on the differences. We have a sort of longer, thinner grip, much easier on the hand than this stubby short thing. All the dimensions have been slimmed down rather nicely compared to the bulk of this guy, and yet, realistically, we're not losing a ton of power. I know the 8mm cartridge has its problems, but this was a slow-moving 11mm. Now, this had the capacity to do more, but they never got near to using the strength of this frame, and yet they carried around all that weight. That's an inefficiency. This, well, let's take a closer look at it, because we have, well, here, let me flip her over. We have a single action, ooh, boom, and double action, pull, 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 bit heavy, drop, boom. Don't forget that heaviness was required as a safety feature. There is no actual manual safety on this pistol. And unique to this gun is actually how nicely sighted it is. We've actually inherited, I don't know how easy it is to make out, we've inherited that bead front sight with a round scalloped rear. There we go. It's a beautiful sight picture that actually appears to have been inherited from the Swiss 1882. Looking at the right side of this revolver, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's yet another fixed cylinder, gate loading and unloading, possibly Abity, that part's true, European wheel gun. But in this case, it's lying to us just a bit. Yes, we have the right side gate, yes, it pivots back, but if you look at these seams here, something fun is probably about to happen. So we'll go ahead and open up the gate, which is the stiffest I've ever seen on an 1892. And then, oh hey, look at this magic trick. By the way, the resistance that I'm experiencing all the way through this is completely intentional. We'll see why in just a second. While we're here though, I want to point out that the latch that holds the arbor in is not actually the gate itself. Instead, it's this guy right here, recessed into the frame somewhat. Here and here you can see it, and it has a pin connection to the gate that we'll be able to see better in our animation. Once this guy's out, you guys know how to handle the rest, just like that old Colt. Now, with the cylinder open, and the gate open in particular, we no longer can engage the hammer. It's actually technically possible to go ahead and close that gate up, which is a little awkward to do on the other side. There we go. And then everything will re-engage like normal. But this isn't a safety problem because your cylinder's out of the way. There's no ammunition in here. And the only other way to get that gate closed is when the cylinder is really in position. That way, if it's ever so slightly out and therefore misaligned with the bore, the gate can't close, the system can't function. Now, single action sort of works in this regard. I can cock the hammer back and pull the trigger. However, it's going to fall only that far, striking, again, that stud coming off the gate, the Abity system. Looking down the face of the revolver, we can see an unusual U-shaped spring that's held in place with a pin going away from you, the viewer. That spring keeps tension on this, good lord, crane all the way through. You can see how much I'm fighting it. Yep, that tension is constantly being applied, and there's a slight bias to the open and to the closed positions. In this way, if you're using the gun on horseback, let me get there. If you're using the gun on horseback, the cylinder doesn't waggle around. It stays where you put it, and therefore is not disrupted and causing you all sorts of trouble loading. You can imagine, without that resistance, what it'd be like to try to chamber and have this just flopping all over the place. Before we go pulling the gun apart, I do want to show you that there is a locking bolt right there. It's attached to the trigger directly. And it interacts with these studs that you're seeing sticking up on the cylinder. These seem to have been vaguely inherited from the Swiss 78, although they've been dramatically reduced in their size. And if I bring this guy into alignment without pre-aligning the stud, which is how most of the time you would, it's actually a very small window to get that thing aligned up in that gap, and then I close the gate, Well, we're going to discover that nothing too terrible happens, and yet, for some reason, so there I didn't align it, right? And I pulled the trigger, and it works fine. It starts doing its job. Now, where I had it, it could do this, but that's really not a problem. So I'm not sure what the issue was. However, French manuals at the time tell you that if you load it up and you check this waggle and it's there, you should go ahead and ease the trigger and rotate it until you're in that correct position. I've never seen that be a worrisome point for a locking bolt revolver in any instructional manuals, and yet the French seem to care, so I'm sharing it with you. Disassembly of this revolver begins here, a slotted screw head that is actually cut for the correct width for a 5-centime coin. I unfortunately don't have one of those, so I'm just gonna use a good old gunsmithing screwdriver. The best way to open a gun like this up is to push gently in on the screw while loosening it up. There's my ka-thunk, and what we've done is we've pressed the plate off on the other side. From here, we'll just flip her open, and our plate is attached, swings over, nothing to lose. Screw is captive, nothing to lose, and the grip comes out. So this is really your big risk, is that you'll lose something larger than your thumb out in the field while you're cleaning up your revolver. So this is really good, actually. Very little problem with this system. As a matter of fact, the swing out cylinder means you can get in there and access all that for cleaning. You can access all the chambers for cleaning very easily without ever removing it from the gun. This is great. So before we go into lock work, I do want to point out one thing right about here. This ridge right here, which sits behind the hand on the side plate. This was the only notable change in the manufacture of the 1892, suggested by a Captain Charles, an arms inspector in Algiers, in October of 1898. He had fitted a raised rib in order to both better support the hand and to prevent improper reassembly with the hand out of place. His insert was accepted about a year later, in 1899, and fitted retroactively to pieces sent in for repair. In 1901, the plate itself was changed to provide the supporting rib. Now overall, we've come full circle to a Fonyu style of lock work, albeit with some modification. Generally, this works like we'd expect. We have a trigger with integrated cylinder stop. We have a hand. We have a nose attached to the hammer with its own spring, in this case a coil spring. And then we have a mainspring that in this case has been modified slightly, because in an original Fonyu, the mainspring was a simple V-spring. It may have used a hammer stirrup, it may have pressed directly, that part's not really critical. The lower arm of the mainspring would have pressed on a separate arm that looks like this. This is now integrated in. That particular feature was patented by Warnant as a simplification of the Fonyu, and he also included some changes that are not in this gun. Now, the rebounding arm is really defined by the rebounding feature. Supposedly, Com Blaine developed the part where it reaches past everything and presses on the hand and the trigger to reset the trigger and keep pressure on the hand towards the cylinder. Fonyu's addition was a ledge right up under here. It's a little difficult to see, but that's why we have an animation. That ledge presses off an extension on the hammer. What does this do for us? Well, it gives us a single action in which there is no sear, because an extension on the hammer hits an extension on the trigger. That's supposedly done by Gilles Marriott many years beforehand. And double action, so let me drop that. As we pull through, like we saw with that earlier Abity, we're going to strike the nose, we're going to slip past the nose, hammer comes crashing down, nose compresses on release. But every time I fire the gun and let go of the trigger, you notice that the hammer automatically rebounds. That's because of pressure here. Boom, rebounded. That means it never gets in the way of loading and unloading, especially with a swing out. That would be really critical. You could imagine damaging that firing pin a lot. And it means it's a lot safer. There's never any chance of it resting there. And this also supposedly serves as a hammer block when in good shape. That's very true, although we've seen in other guns that if a Fonyu system wears down, you can overcome that spring pressure if you drop the gun from a very tall surface. Other Fonyu guns often adopt hammer blocks. Now, unique to the French design of this Fonyu-like system is the fact that they have, well, an Abity gate, although we've seen other Fonyus with Abity gates, that is being biased by a sort of ribbony spring down here. And on the mainspring, We've ditched the stirrup, we've adapted to a roller on one side, and then technically the other side of the mainspring is also resting on a roller, although that is attached to the hand. It's a little difficult to see in there, but essentially that pin right there has a roller that's resting here. This was their solution for getting rid of that linkage and the other cross linkage. All that effort to really reduce friction on this interaction came down to, what if we just made it spin? Just like we make it spin back here. You know what, I've seen this inverted on Colt revolvers from the 1850s, so yeah, just rediscovering the wheel in the literal sense. Now, this is a beautifully sublime and simple lockwork. In some ways, it is as simple as you can possibly get while keeping an Abadie safety, which is a really good feature. Theoretically, a Warnant lockwork is simpler, but you can't really get that to work well with a Warnant without adding a bunch of parts like the British did. So this, overall, very, very good. We have easy access to lockwork. They've numbered all the parts, just like the Swiss did, for disassembly in the correct order, although I'll leave it to the animation to see all those details. And it's very easy to clean. It's very easy to swing out the cylinder clean in there. And we're doing as few springs as possible for as much function as possible. We're close to the same number of springs as the 1873, and yet we have a swing out cylinder with a friction spring, and we get this Abadie safety and all this other stuff because the lockwork has been reduced to 2 springs. Just the one for the nose and the one back here, although be this a very complicated design. Now, if you're thinking, wow, this is really majestic and beautiful and I've never seen anything like it, I will happily remind you about the Italian Bodeo of 1889. Just remove the wheels, and that's it. We even have the same Abadie system. We do not, however, have a swing out cylinder, so the Italians really missed out on that option. Now, while it's actually fairly easy to see inside this guy, we can still do a little bit better with one of Bruno's animations.
Like so many revolvers before, we'll open this one by swinging the gate back. We can't see it here, but internally, this is engaged in automatic safety. Let's get a better look. Opening the gate turns a stud on its axis, which in turn compresses the hammer nose, the part responsible for double action fire. In this way, the revolver can only be fired when the gate is closed, preventing any accidents when the cylinder is misaligned. The gate itself does not free the cylinder. Instead, it pivots this latch. So we can safely swing out the cylinder and load up 6 rounds. By the way, this friction spring, set inside the front of the frame, keeps pressure on the crane while it's being manipulated. That way, the cylinder doesn't bounce around while we're loading. Once we're done, we can close up the cylinder and the gate, which re-engages the trigger, readying the revolver for action. Overall, the lockwork is like so many others of its era, a Fanyu-derived triple action with rebounding hammer. For single action fire, we cock back the hammer, causing its lower extension to drag along the trigger until the two meet, locking into place, until the trigger is pulled. Double action is also fairly straightforward. Pulling the trigger presses its extension into the underside of the nose, tipping back the hammer until it slips past. When the trigger is released, its extension compresses the spring-loaded nose, allowing the extension to pass and the nose to snap back into position. The mainspring provides power for the entire lockwork. The upper arm presses on the hammer with the help of a smoothing roller. The lower arm does quite a bit of work. Reaching around the hammer, it puts pressure on the hand, biasing it into the cylinder's ratchet teeth. Another roller, set into the hand itself, prevents drag as the hand moves up and down the arm. The same pressure is transmitted to the trigger, resetting it when released. The lower arm also serves to rebound the hammer. When the trigger is released, its horizontal shelf meets a lower extension off the hammer, tilting it back automatically. And finally, the trigger includes both cylinder stops. The one at the front serves as a locking bolt, preventing the cylinder from rotating when at rest. The one at the rear is the active stop. As we pull the trigger, the front bolt releases the cylinder so it can be rotated by the hand, and the rear stop rises, eventually halting it in the correct position. When we're out of ammo, we just open the gate, swing out the cylinder, and press on the ejector rod to expel our spent casings. Alright, let's go shoot it.
Well, that's stiff. Like I said earlier, on adoption, 5,000 of these guys were ordered as a sort of warm-up. They were delivered by the end of the year. The average cost was estimated at 56 francs, 30 centimes. Just for comparison, it said a Lebel rifle was closer to 43 francs. Interestingly, there was no official cartridge until 1893. That's because minor testing was still ongoing, and the revolvers were not being issued yet. Not until enough could be stocked up anyway. Curiously, the initial charge was one of black powder. This was probably intended as a stopgap until a perfected pistol powder could be worked out. And yes, eventually, a smokeless cartridge with slightly higher muzzle velocity would appear. Although the only date I could find suggested for its adoption was 1908. I sadly wasn't able to prove this out otherwise. In any case, both cartridges use the same copper-jacketed bullet, roughly 8mm in diameter. This combination of still fairly low speed, small diameter, and low bullet weight make for a sadly anemic cartridge, a constant criticism of an otherwise excellent handgun. The 1892 was produced with a serial prefix beginning with the letter F. This rose from F1 to F99,999, before cycling over to G. They had reached roughly H65,000 at the start of the Great War. Production rushed into the I series before being halted in favor of making more rifles instead. It's estimated only 20,000 or so were produced in that last block. It's also worth noting that while most 1892 revolver barrels have their date of manufacture prominently displayed after the letter S, which stood for Saint-Étienne, the later H series and all of the incomplete I series examples do not have their dates marked. That's because their barrels were sourced from subcontractors not proofed or dated by Moss. By the way, the two letters set on each Moss barrel represent the initials of the director and the administrative officer at the time of production. It's also possible, by the way, to have a mismatch of serial number, inspector names, and date. That's because some revolvers were re-barreled later, meaning the old serial number was recycled with new dates and inspectors. Returning to our alphabet lesson, production was restarted in 1921 with serial prefix L. J was likely skipped, and K had been reserved for mysterious reasons. Only a few examples have turned up, and it's likely they were a reserve prefix for training or demonstration arms. The L series is estimated to have petered out somewhere near 45,000 units in 1924. Total production was therefore an estimated 365,000, give or take. Model 1892 revolvers were almost exclusively produced for officers until the early 1900s. They then began to expand issue to specialty roles like we have seen in so many other armies. During the Great War, this expansion became even more severe, and frankly, they couldn't keep up. So we'll talk more on that point when we cover the Ruby pistol. Shortly after Army adoption, the French Navy also took on the Model 1892. Its estimated 10 to 15,000 units were for the Navy. They do not appear to have their own serial blocks and can be identified by an anchor mark on the butt of the grip. The 1892 was also adopted by the gendarmerie, police, and game wardens. I should also mention it was also adopted by one foreign power, Romania, who took it as their Model 1896, identical to the French version, though it wasn't produced by Moss. Instead, they were ordered from Manufacture Française d'Armes et Circulaires de Saint-Étienne. Same city, different commercial manufacturer. As for service life, the new 8mm revolver was fairly fresh off the assembly line for the Second Madagascar expedition, and French support for the Cretan revolt was naval. However, it was definitely present for the Boxer Rebellion, followed by various smaller colonial conflicts before the Great War. And as I've said before, that massive conflict not only proved the worth of a good handgun, it also consumed them at an alarming rate. So much so that production simply couldn't keep up and was abandoned in favor of foreign solutions. French ordnance turned to the US and then much more heavily to Spain for .32 caliber automatic pistols. Notably, the Ruby, the Star, and later on, Colt and Smith & Wesson clones, which chambered the 8mm ordnance cartridge. The Ruby alone was produced in such numbers that a 1920 inventory revealed 580,000 still on hand. Recall the estimated total production of all 1892 revolvers was just 365,000. Despite this, the 1892 remained the official sidearm of the French army until it was eventually replaced by a more modern automatic. And even after its introduction, the 1892 soldiered on. At some point, the beautiful blued finish was traded for a sort of hard black paint like you'd see on the 1935A pistol. This is actually what you'll usually find on 1892s today. Service continued through the Second World War. Those captured by the Germans received the designation Revolver 637F. Even after 1945, 1892 revolvers were still being refurbished in facilities in Indochina and Algeria, specifically for colonial use. In those cases, you can even find them with a Parkerized finish. Officially, they were finally decommissioned in 1948. That is not really a bad run. Now, before we wrap this out, I do have something of a depressing story to share, but it does have to do with the development of the model 1892. At least it's intrinsically linked with the story. When Boulanger was removed, he had quite a few fans, so much so that he became involved in a schism in French politics. Long story short, he ran for and secured the deputy for Paris. Many of his supporters expected him to seize the whole of the French government. However, he chose to be patient, but his opposition was not. Boulanger would be charged with conspiracy and treason. A warrant was let out for his arrest. He fled to Brussels, then to London. His base was shocked at his retreat, and for the most part turned on him. In 1891, he would actually return to Belgium and committed suicide at the grave of his recently deceased mistress. He supposedly accomplished this with the aid of one of the prototypes of the 1885 revolver, a beautifully decorated gift, serial number 3. Alright, that distressing footnote aside, I have some thanks to give, because this episode was only possible with some help from my friends. Special thanks must go to people like user Alpha Golf on our Discord for basically being our revolver patent archivist, occasionally supported by other volunteers. Specific to French patents, I need to thank my friend Ludovic Bertrand. He's run down plenty of patents, but has also fleshed out extra bits of French biographical data many times for this show. And finally, give a little love to the chap over at Bloke on the Range for helping me sort out a bit of French slang while assembling this ridiculous puzzle. Now, let's finally get May's opinion on this beautiful Modele 1892. All right, once more, we've made room for May.
Hello.
And we have, the French Modele 1892.
Not a stranger to the show.
No.
Not in general.
Let's talk about our previous experience with it after we've had some first impressions. Because as of this point, you've become accustomed to a lot of European and American revolvers.
Unfortunately, yes.
I'm sorry, you used to like revolvers.
Oh, yeah. And then I had to handle all of them that you've had to put back together because invariably when they come in, they're not working properly. None of them are.
In my defense, we've been working backwards. So your revolver experiences have gotten worse. Yeah. We've now come back.
Go figure.
We've come back to the very first revolver we did for the series. Maybe your love will return.
Maybe. Maybe? Really?
All right, so ignoring all that, let's pretend you haven't handled an 1892 before. Let's pretend I haven't told you it's French or anything like that.
Okay.
I put this in your hands.
Okay.
I say it's pre-1900, as you could probably guess.
Okay. Are you going to tell me anything about like caliber or anything like that?
No, but I mean, you could kind of look at it and figure out that it's 8mm. Yeah. So I just hand you that and I say, look, this is from sometime just before 1900. Okay. And your impressions are what? What's your first thought?
Well, first thought is, what drawer did you pull this out of? Because the condition of this piece, I mean, when you're looking at it, here, let me hold it up this way so you can see it, is gorgeous. I mean, the bluing is all there. The strawing on the gate and on the hammer and on the trigger is still there. It looks absolutely beautiful. It doesn't look like something that I would consider to be a Marshall revolver. It seems more like it was from a neutral country, like that Swiss 1882 we've handled before. Or
yes, I actually happen to have one of those here. And the deep dark blue, the strawing.
It's all there.
And by the way, this is what the French trials were handling when everybody went, can we get this?
Right.
So much so, by the way, that the early versions of these 82s, this one has updated wooden grips from later on. These are replacement. Or later manufacture.
Those grips suck, by the way.
We need to shoot one with the original ebonite grips.
I would love that, actually.
So the original grips which were a type of plastic. Actually, the French say they were ebonite. I'm not sure if they were that or gutta percha or what. I'm not sure. But they were an early sort of organic plastic, right?
Sure.
Those grips tended to have cracking problems. They ended up going to wood. But in the trials data, we see that the French were actually considering, should we go over to ebonite? But they actually went with wood. And then here we have the Swiss years later going, oh, I guess wood was better. So it's interesting how this came back towards that eventually.
Right.
But visually, I agree with you. These are absolutely comparable.
Yeah, which is why I'm seeing the looks and I'm just like, neutral country or maybe like a private purchase from an officer or something like that.
Right.
You know?
And then if I tell you, no, that's mass production for a major power.
No, that does not make sense for the looks on this one.
Now, the funny thing is you see them later with the black paint and everything on them, or even Parkerized. You would believe that was mass production for a major army, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Are you kidding me?
That's like the one we first shot, which was black painted naval service. So.
That one, more martial. I believe that.
Right.
But then I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, you know, it's also kind of like a lot more of the small bore, the European revolver. So not just the Swiss boy, but like the Rasengaster,
right.
1898.
I think I still have it because we used it. Yeah,
the Abity?
We have the Abity that we were using earlier. You know,
it's an Abity.
This Abity's got some wear on it, but this would have been blued with some good strawing on it at some point in its history. It probably looked quite nice, but that was more of a neutral-ish country.
Yeah.
These are both sort of small frame, small bore European revolvers.
Yep.
And then we still have that Danish Fanyu. Small bore,
right.
Small frame. We haven't done an episode on these yet, but one day that's going to take some.
I think we've done some little videos on it.
It's shown up a couple times.
Yeah.
I'm doing some repair work on another example, and we're still digging up the history. We actually have a friend helping us out to research these with primary documents. Nice. Because there's not a lot to go on.
But yeah, this is kind of reminiscent of those types of revolvers.
Sure.
However,
and yet,
I mean, I will say, I think the grip is a little bit longer. Yeah, no, definitely. Out of all of them. No, these all have short grips by comparison to this guy.
I believe the Danish is the shortest or close to the shortest, and I barely fit my hand on there.
I like the length. This is better.
On the Swiss, I barely fit my hand on the Swiss, and that's including using the little hole for the shoulder stock option.
Right.
On the Abity, boy, maybe this is the shortest. I'm coming off a little bit.
Yeah, you are. Whereas this one, you're probably square on with that guy.
You've
got room. You've got wiggle room.
I have over a quarter inch of extra space.
So yeah, that's already an improvement, I would say.
That's a radical difference. Almost all of these European revolvers feel a little short in my big hand. This one does not.
No, it definitely doesn't. So maybe that puts it more into the martial category. Okay, we're getting more of a feel for being able to handle it. Okay, cool. All right, well, next up, looks-wise. Obviously, this is a gate loader revolver. What's with that gate, man?
They're not all like that.
No, because I know the first one was not like that.
That's the worst gate we have ever experienced in terms of pressure. This gun was full of crud. It looks beautiful on the outside.
Oh, yeah.
On the inside, it was gummed up.
Okay.
So I scrubbed it all out.
Ooh, WD-40?
No, it didn't smell like it. I'm not sure what got in there. There was grit, too. There's some sort of fine...
Yeah.
Not fine, actually. I wonder if it had a gunpowder issue because it felt almost like flake powder, but not really. There's something gritty in there.
Okay.
Nobody cares that much.
Sure.
But I had to take it all apart to the point that I normally leave the gate spring in, but it was so stiff that I got worried something was actually grinding in there. So I took the gate spring out, which is a huge pain in the butt. No, it's fine. It's just that stiff. Wow. It is extremely stiff.
Huh. Maybe the tolerances are just that tight on it?
Or it's just that, that thing is mint.
Yeah, it really is. So maybe they're just more worked in by the time, we normally get to an 1892.
I don't know what happened to that gun for it to stay out of it, because that one's barrel date is 1902.
Oh.
And so you're talking about, what is it, 2023 now? 121 years.
Grandpa never pulled it out of the drawer. It just sat there. He got it and he put it in the drawer and it stayed there.
It was a dry drawer too, let me tell you. So
okay, so obviously I would think gate loader. Well, there's definitely no room for me to be able to load a cartridge there with the gate in the way.
You also have no ejector. Oh.
Swing out. Why is the gate still there? I mean, did they just have the tooling set up and you think that maybe they just kept the gate as a result of that? Or
I suspect they knew the Abity safety. They knew it worked. And that's what they were experienced with. And this is where you got to understand, the 1892 has this development curve, right? Where from 1885 to go to it's like the two worst choices in this gun happen because they're in a hurry. The first bad choice is the 8mm cartridge, which is frankly very weak. And that is decided when Boulanger is in charge. And he says, we're trying 8mm, and right? And so they rush to get the 8mm.
Right.
So they go, the 1885 prototypes go 8mm, right? Then he gets out as they're kind of working at this high pace, but then he gets out of the way, right? And then once he's gone, they can go, okay, hold on, slow down, let's think about this. But they had ended production of the old 73 at that same time. So then they kind of coast for a while. And actually, this is kind of where the Fanyus come into play. It's called a Fanyu Maguire. It's a very popular private purchase in France at that time. And my suspicion is those start showing up more and more in the late 80s, which is when no one's making these. So officers are probably actually being forced to pick the Fanyu Maguire and other sort of 11mm chamberings that are showing up in the market. I suspect the Fanyu Maguire kind of became the unofficial handgun of France while waiting for that to get finished. But I can't prove that.
Right.
So,
mystery for another day then.
Right. So,
also noticing that swinging out to the right. So that's intended for me to hold this in my left while loading in my right.
Right. You're supposed to change hands.
Okay.
Which is very common for all these gate loaders because all the gate loaders are set up on the left side. So everybody acts like it's very unusual because we're used to modern context of everything swinging out left.
Well, yeah, it's because you think of the Smith & Wessons and the Colt. They're all swinging out to the left, load with your left hand. Well, there's no, this one's, it's still expecting that right hand load.
Modern doctrine for infantry and mechanization is that you leave the firearm in your control hand in the control position and then handle loading with your non-dominant hand. At the time, though, you would use your reins in your left hand and your sword or your firearm in your right hand. And then when you needed to finally manipulate the firearm, the thing is you can't keep your reins in your hand and reach for your ammo because you're going to be telling the horse something you don't mean to.
Yeah.
So you put the gun in with the reins, and then that's static enough that you can just leave the gun where it is and work in your ammo, which is why the Abadie especially becomes very important so that you can control that even easier than sitting there and fighting with it.
Makes sense.
So that sense of right-handedness for loading stayed over for this gun because, again, cavalry focus.
Sure. And then I'm also noticing from the checkering to the knurling on the hammer and on the gate and on the ejector rod, everything feels very pronounced on this one. It looks to just be like they really took their time to make everything just kind of really fine and really well done. It's
very sharp.
Yes, it is.
Very aggressive texturing. When you start dragging on that hammer with your thumb pad, you really have a grip.
Oh, yeah. No, this is just skin on hammer contact. It's very easy to just even manipulate the hammer barely.
Out of all these Euro revolvers, I will say I have never felt checkering so sharp that I was assured that I wouldn't slip off of it with a bleeding hand.
Oh, yeah.
But that is aggressive.
Oh, yeah. And then speaking of aggressive, what's with these little notches here? They look like they're supposed to be for cylinder stops, and I haven't quite... So I don't necessarily see all the episode ahead of time, so my brain's thinking, well, I'm assuming that there are some sort of cylinder stop notches, but why are there two?
Yeah, so they're set to stop the cylinder right at alignment. And then the French manual, as I said in the episode, actually tells you to try to keep them in that alignment so that you have less waggle.
Okay.
So where it's at now, there's this much waggle, which I guess they didn't like for some reason.
Okay.
So you ease it there, and you have less waggle. In either condition, what they're really doing is they're preventing you from, let's say, firing 2 rounds, 1, 2, and then reholstering or moving around in the environment and brushing up against something and rolling your cylinder.
Well, there's no rolling that.
And then you expect to have 4 rounds left, but what you really do is you fire 2, let's say 1 or you would fire between 3 and 2, 1, whatever. You'd fire your extra rounds, and then you'd get click, click from the 2 rounds you fired previously, and you'd think, am I out of ammo? No, your cylinder has indexed to a different position because it got bumped or brushed or whatever.
Right.
So the thing is to prevent that one little mistake that can happen of getting this out of position. It also is sort of a safety thing. A lot of guys, I think more often than that combat reason, you're going to have guys that fire 2 rounds. They're going to say, okay, the 2 empties are here because I'm used to using this gun.
Right.
I've got 4 live in there. And then as they're loading or changing ammo, they make some mistake because they didn't account for the fact when they put it in their holster and got it out half an hour later at the other end of the range, it's now out of position.
Right.
So this is meant to prevent what you consider almost like out of battery rotation. You don't want rotation when you're not using the firearm as intended. So they're there, and the best I can tell from looking at other Martial revolvers of the period, I think they were actually inspired by the Swiss 1878. That's my guess. Okay. Because it has a band all the way around that has the same dimples.
It's aggressive as heck.
Right. And I can't prove that. There might have been other commercial revolvers in the market, but just looking at what was available, it's most likely the Swiss inspired that decision because they use the same exact trigger system in both their 78 and 82. In the 82, it's recessed notches. In the 78, they were proud, and that's proud.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Okay, well, yeah, that pretty much covers all of the looks. This definitely just appears to be like it's not meant to be for military use, and yet it is.
So really the two guns to compare that one to directly are, it's supposed to be a departure from the 78.
Okay.
So if you pick up a 78, here, I'll take that.
Okay.
Which do you like better?
Ooh. Well, obviously off the bat, this one is insanely heavy. At least I can open the gate, though. Feel-wise, looks-wise, this is chunky. It's beefy. It doesn't feel... Oh, the hammer's lighter.
The springs are a little more worn out in that one.
Yeah, I kind of like it more worn in. However, we have handled a worn-in 92 before. However, that being said, this just feels chunky and awkward in my hand. Like, it doesn't really feel comfortable like the weight unbalanced did on the 92.
Right. And then also, let's consider the fact of loading and unloading.
Yeah.
Did you want to...
I mean, it's gate loading.
go ahead and get that ejector rod out. Let's go for that. Yeah, a lot of...
Why?
I know. Push away. Turn.
I don't think I can. I think my fingers are a little too greasy. That's what I get for putting lotion on.
Oh my god.
Okay, I feel a little bit better. I feel a little better.
This actually was fairly notorious in French service. That was not considered a positive feature.
Right.
Is how difficult. Now, putting it back is easy. It snaps over.
Yeah.
But you got to get out significantly and down. And that's a lot of spring pressure to deal with. And then, of course, that spring that's in there doing all that doesn't do you any favors about, returning the rod.
But no, loading and unloading, obviously, not gate loading, whatchamacallit? Swing out cylinder. Thank you. I couldn't think of it for a second. Obviously, that's going to be superior in terms of rapidity. And then on top of that, when I open the gate on this one, it's got the Abity system inside of it. So there's actually an added safety bit to it. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, definitely we'll go for the 92.
Now, how do you feel about the spring tensioner in the loading system? Did you notice that at all?
What do you mean, in the 92? Is that what we talked about?
I believe, yes, in the 92. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm looking around. I still have that Colt. So the Colt just sort of has friction. It's tight. But if you notice...
You can waggle. Meanwhile, that one, when I pulled the cylinder out, I did notice it kind of just... It stays wherever I settle it.
Right.
I kind of like that.
Oh, good lord. If I get this guy open...
If I'm thinking like if I'm on a horse and bouncing around... Yeah, it takes so much force to even barely shift it.
It's not waggling, and I'm putting some oomph in there.
You are, yes.
So...
I like the idea of that.
It's kind of brilliant. If you think about it, like if you're riding along and this is... That's not
meant
unbelievable.
to be on the horse.
Yeah.
The Colt was not meant
Also,
for
you have to
horse.
take your reins in your right hand. What were they doing?
I don't know.
I feel like the French had it right, believe it or not, on that feature. So... Oh, good lord.
That pretty much covers the ergonomics on this guy.
Now, I compared it to 73.
Yeah.
82.
Okay.
Notoriously, you did not like the double action trigger on this.
Nope, it was terrible.
And so, almost very similar load data, actually. So recoil in the cartridges should be, if it weren't for the differences in the dimensions, they should be almost interchangeable.
Sure.
So realistically, in terms of recoil and everything else, these are very comparable guns. You're shooting almost the same cartridge. You have very similar sights and everything.
Okay.
You're really just assessing sort of the lock work and the feel of the grip and things like that. So why don't you talk about shooting that guy?
Well, lining up my sights, I've got pretty much what I had on the 82, the bead in the basket kind of setup, which I don't dislike it as a concept, but unfortunately, it kind of in practice tends to be a little hard to be insanely accurate with those.
Now you got me curious.
Well, I think that frankly just,
I weirdly like them.
Inverted triangles, I think those typically in general tend to work out better.
I don't agree.
Okay.
I think a square notch sight is actually like a crude square notch sight for handgun at defensive distance. If we're talking about just shape.
Yes, actually, you're not wrong. Square notches would be better.
So something the 1911 gets kind of close, but it doesn't get there. Realistically, you don't see bulky enough sights on handguns until way later.
Well, that's what I was thinking at the time. At the time, you're going to mostly end up having, like a half moon or something like that front side, and you're going to have a V-notch rear, which that's pretty standard. When I'm saying between the two, I frankly think bead-in circle kind of is a little just too...
Ideal? It's perfect.
Okay, no.
I'm going to make the argument. Are you ready for the argument?
Okay, what's your argument?
I think that the reason why the sights are so fine on these old handguns is because they didn't use them. and I mean that. I think they considered the gun as having two functions, single and double action.
Right.
If I am taking an aimed shot, that means I have time to aim. If I have time to aim, I'm going to cock it. So in other words, if I have a fleeing enemy at 50 yards, a long handgun shot, and he's kind of trucking, I'm going to go, you know what? Even though I could fire quickly, my hit rate is very low. I'm going to cock, point and aim, and pull the trigger. And that's how they were trained on target shooting, is to point, aim, pull trigger in single action. For double action, and we actually saw this working with our friend Rob behind the scenes on a video that hasn't been released yet. Even all the way to World War II training documents for the British. Double action was largely unaimed fire, and they trained all the way through World War II in the United States and Britain and everywhere else in unaimed double action. You would pull your gun, present it, not even up here. You would present it and just fire. And so at that point, if you're trying to work fast at close range, why have sights at all?
Right.
So if you're going to put sights on, you would put on very fine ones for aimed fire.
Okay.
In that regard, I love the bead, because the bead does a lovely job, even for novices, of telling you whether you're centered horizontally and vertically, and even at oblique angles. The bead in the basket is very good at not screwing up the sight picture when you're an idiot. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Think about new shooters. How many times you have to tell them how to level the front and rear sights on a notch?
I mean, yes.
Also, one of the big problems between having a half moon sight or some sort of later Nagant 1895 like shark fin sight is that they were looking for the contrast to be able to pick it up quickly to get the sight, right? Well, this is almost like a weird aperture sight where you go, oh, round thing goes in round thing. I can very quickly tell that the round things are aligned. It's much easier on the human brain. That's my argument.
I personally don't think so. I think having to basically sit there and settle that bead in the basket is going to be too much time.
You think it's too fiddly?
Yeah, I think it's too much.
Okay, point it fast. Go.
No.
Oh, okay.
But I just disagree. I think it takes too much time. I think your idea that it doesn't take as much time or it takes less time than like a shark fin with a V-notch. I think you're wrong. I think we're going to have to do a test.
I know some guys that are parts manufacturers.
Okay.
Is there a top-railed handgun? Because we could just get like a little bead.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
We should try that.
I'm trying to think if there's a pistol that just a straight top rail. Because it's got to be out here.
Yeah.
It can't be, on a rifle.
We'll try it.
Okay. Well, now we're into theoreticals.
Yeah. Okay. So actually shooting that. We've talked about loading. Single action hammer pull is pretty heavy.
Do you want to compare?
Well, no, I want to talk about this one first.
Okay.
And then double action trigger pull, pretty heavy, but even all the way through, fortunately.
Did you feel a hump in there at all?
In the double action pull?
Yeah.
Let me try one more time. No, I don't think so. I'm trying to ride the hammer a little bit. I'm pretty sure I don't feel a hump in there.
It's heavy, but it's very smooth.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the wheels they added.
The wheels?
Yeah, they added a wheel.
Do they go round and round?
They added a wheel to the top of the mainspring where it comes in contact with the hammer.
Okay.
Almost like a Colt. You remember like when we were doing the later Dragoons, they added the wheel on the hammer?
Yeah.
Same idea, but it's the other way around. It's on the spring.
Okay.
And then where it's a Fonyu system, and where that rebound arm goes across and catches the hand, they added a wheel where it interacts with the hand. So when that rebound arm is doing this, it's on a roller. And so it smooths out even more.
Oh, so like Martini, like the Mark I, it's a nice smooth.
Yeah. The overdoing the trigger thing.
Yeah.
So like this one, this is a Fonyu system. It doesn't have the wheel. So the question would be, can you feel a little bit of snag? I guess we'll have to do. I mean, that needs its own episode someday. Oh.
Yeah, I feel.
You can almost see it in the cylinder. Hold it up while you're doing that. See, it's
right
coming.
there.
Yeah, it's coming in stages. You see it's creep.
Yeah.
And then let's try this one. So this isn't very scientific, but there's a little bit of slow down there.
Well, I'm also trying to pull it really slowly.
Oh, try to do one even pull. Let's see. Yeah?
Yeah. No, that felt pretty even.
Yeah?
Like, I don't really feel
Why
much
do I have
with
this? You're supposed to
I don't know. Just giving you stuff. Okay, but they are both heavy. We'll say that. Both are very much heavy for hammer pull back and trigger pull for the double action versus single action. However, even.
Yeah.
So at least it feels nice while I'm doing it.
I mean, the French 1892 is sort of the lowest friction fondue that you could have. The only thing I could think is to add a roller to the nose, you know, so it would slip off a roller instead of the nose. But
yeah.
that has its own issues. So, you fired it.
Yep, fired it. So
bang.
recoil, not much to it.
Nothing?
It was nice. It was fine.
Here's the problem with that nice recoil. How much do you trust that cartridge to really put somebody down?
I mean, I don't trust one round to necessarily put them down. I imagine, you know, if someone's got the adrenaline going, I mean, I'm not taking this up against the Moros or anything like that. Right. So
it's a little odd to me. It's one of those things I kind of wonder if you would say, 45 Colt, right? The long Colt.
Yes.
We'd call that the decider, right? Decider.
Definitely got stopping power.
And then...
Can't argue with that.
You would almost have like... You would call maybe like 38 Smith & Wesson, maybe 38 Special. Actually, 38 Special is probably better.
Special, yeah.
Let's go Special. 38 Special, we might call it the Persuader.
Okay.
Right?
It's very persuasive.
I'd
argue it's pretty persuasive.
And then I feel like this...
Suggestion?
I might call it like,
Suggester?
I might call it the Duswaiter, where it's just like, I don't wanna. Like, don't shoot me with it.
See, I like the suggester because it's just like, you know, maybe we might want to try doing this. Like, you're offering up, like, maybe we should try this instead.
The Colt 45 is just punching you in the face. The 38 Special is being like, stop. And this is like, whoa there, buddy.
It's like, please don't come at me, bro.
I'm just saying, I don't want to be shot by any of them. I don't want to be shot by a 22. But I'm picking this over all the others. If I take one round, I'm taking that. And that's because we know, and we're not just making fun. I know a lot of people are going to go, wow, it's close to 32 ACP, and that's a good cartridge. But if you just got a... And there's also guys that carry around rim-fired defensive ammo. I get it, right?
Okay.
But if we're talking a game of min-maxing, right, we have the same problem. For the weight and size that we put into the firearm, we could have gotten something else. And the same thing here. This was a very heavy, strong firearm, but the cartridge was too weak. That's actually it's lighter than this, but it's still a fairly heavy firearm. It's fairly large. You could have fit a better cartridge in there with very little changes.
Okay.
Or even maybe made it faster. I don't know.
Maybe. They
didn't. They chose to have easier shooting, which is very much similar to this decision.
Yeah, it's very Swiss. It's very neutral of them.
Right. Fortunately, they were trying to win wars against Germany.
Yeah, that's not a time for neutrality. That's a time for stopping power.
Very civilized cartridge. So
it's too civilized.
The U.S. would not have taken that into the Philippines.
Considering they're going into a war, it's too civilized for that.
Right. This is not a colonial cartridge by any means.
No.
So I wouldn't want it against a determined attacker, and we know it. We're not being subjective here. In their own data, it did not stop the horse.
Right.
It's literally supposed to stop the horse, but
what horse? What horse did they test this on?
It was a pair. The worst part is like a pair of old mares. There wasn't even like a big horse.
That's so sad.
Yeah, you don't want to know.
I know.
How many horses have.
The little guard tests, I know.
You know, sad. By the way, we got, people get sad about that. I'm going to tell you, there's way worse that happens to horses just in cavalry alone.
Oh,
like, just having to deal with horses in warfare. Bad things happen in warfare.
Yep.
So, even in training, like, how many people do you know that have helicopter training accidents? Well, the horses used to be the helicopter training accident of their day.
Oh my God, I just imagine a horse is a helicopter.
That's no, the horse is not the helicopter. No. It's a different, they're on the ground.
Okay.
They don't get in the helicopter.
No spinning?
No.
Okay.
Jesus. I'm just saying, when things went wrong back in the day, it was usually around a horse compared to, now as an osprey.
Fair.
So.
Okay. Anyway, yeah, that's it. That's pretty much the whole shooting experience there. Okay.
And then would you say that your opinion has changed in any great way since when we did this many years ago, when we didn't know really anything about it, and I was still saying it was a modified Schmidt-Galland action because that's what everybody wrote down in the official documentation.
That's some old school dig there. I can't even remember what I said back then.
Right. You probably were like, I don't know, it's the revolver. It's the first one we shot.
I probably was just like, oh, revolver, all that wouldn't bang.
Kind of heavy. Would you say you have a better appreciation for the mechanism?
I have a better understanding. of the mechanism and what all is happening internally. So I can appreciate things like it's got a rebounding hammer, which you would think, oh, that's not that big of a deal. No, it wasn't that common for the time period on this one to have a rebounding hammer. That's actually really cool. There were several that were still in production after that didn't have a rebounding hammer. It's not hard.
Do you remember when we first started dealing with non-rebounding hammers in filming and you'd have to be like, dang it, and just manually, like you kept forgetting to manually cock the thing?
Yeah. Every time.
That's a really good test, by the way. A lot of people will say, well, why do I need this automatic feature? Because it's just training. You're just training. If you delete the automatic feature, wait 50 years, and no one can even figure it out. Or not the automatic. If you delete the manual in favor of automatic, and no one can even figure it out, that's a good sign that it needed to be removed. Because it is much more natural for it to not be there at all.
I'm just sorry, but that's actually a really good feature set.
Yeah.
However, I really wish I could remember back then what I was saying. However, nowadays, I mean, at the time...
Where are we ranking this?
It's not up there. It's super small cartridge, so it's not that great. I mean, at least I've got 6 of them, but again, I'm not coming for other revolvers.
It's not confidence-inspiring, is it?
No, it really is not.
Fairly heavy double action.
Yep.
Fairly light cartridge.
However... At least it does have the swing out cylinder. That's actually a really good plus for a revolver.
Oh, for European revolvers?
Pretty dang great.
You're looking at big bore top brakes. In World War I, we're talking about big bore top brakes.
Yep.
That have their own issues. And then you're looking at small bore gate loaders, except for... Well, no, even the U.S. had gone back to big bore for their revolvers. Like the U.S. tried small bore swing out. I can't think of another small bore swing out other than the ones that U.S. abandoned before going to
no, I can't think of one either. I'm trying to, but I'm sure we're missing something, or there's something more to be discovered.
No, I can't think of it, to be honest with you. The swing out really gives it an advantage, but
It
the
does.
problem is it gives it the advantage on the second round of fire.
Right, in which case these weren't really expected to be for that. This was probably just your last resort.
Yeah, you kind of like, a lot of revolvers, you're thinking, let me just empty this thing and go.
Right.
Once you get to World War I, you had these trench assaults. We're talking about the trench cleaners. Those are the guys that are dropping mags and throwing in new mags and doing it again and doing it again. And they might get through 2 or 3 mags in a fight. But that wasn't the doctrine for this. The doctrine for this is we have an officer. He's not supposed to be in the fight, and if he is, it's sort of like 1 stray, 2 stray guys, and you're supposed to bang, 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 and then run the You're hoping your boys are filling the gap pretty quickly.
So realistically, then that means having this be a swing out cylinder doesn't really matter because they're not in that doctrine set up. Oh, well, cavalry.
That's it.
Are we using it repeatedly with cavalry then? Unloading and reloading.
Yes, that's really it. Cavalry is the only excuse for tacticaling a revolver at that time. But it's often not enough of an excuse to build an entire handgun around just being in the saddle and shooting, because when you do that, you get something like what we saw with way back in the Black Powder Walker, where the gun is so heavy because it's serving essentially as its own
gyroscope?
Gyroscopic force, right? It's just sort of self-balancing because of its weight.
Right.
And it's resisting inertia, and that lets you pull your shot. Right. But then good luck carrying it around on your hip as a sign of authority.
Right.
So we're splitting between 2 very different goals, which ultimately doesn't get solved until we get into automatics, actually. Automatics tend to clean up this problem because of the detachable box magazine. But yeah, it's trying to be 2 things at once. All of them are, to a certain degree.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Which is a little wild to think about.
Yeah.
So overall, would you accept it in the Great War?
So I would think that I would put it over the Swiss 82. I would put it over the Abity 86 in general. Where I start to have trouble is it's kind of even with the Rostengasser in that the Rostengasser gives me an extra 2 rounds, so that's already putting it above it. However, if I am using this in cavalry terms, having it being a swing-out cylinder, that's going to be a lot better for that. So it kind of, in some ways, is even with a Rostengasser. Now, if I have the option to take like a Ruby or something like that, I'd rather do that. Okay, so you're going to put it above the Nagant 1895 gas seal. Yes.
You're going to put it above the Swedish and Norwegian Nagant 6 shots. that are 7.5 like this. They're smoother than the 82, but again, no swing out.
Right.
So
the swing out's going to automatically put it into a separate category above most of them, frankly.
Right. It gets a little weird with the Rostengosser.
Right, because extra count.
2 more rounds versus the time it takes to reload. That starts to get kind of critical.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's piss everybody off. This is a Colt New Navy. Actually, I didn't have one of these when we did that episode.
Yeah, it sucks you didn't.
Well, I've been doing some more digging on these, and one day they might get a touch-up episode.
Okay.
Because at the time, we noticed that they have a very unusual locking mechanism, and they fall out of time very easily because of the way the crane is. They also fall out of time due to fouling.
Right.
Which is something I did not know in that episode until I got to play with an original and really in good shape and tinker with it. The loading gate is providing some of the biasing force for the timing, which is inherited from the 1878.
That's what I was going to say, like the Colt 78, yeah.
Yeah, but that's only a sprag. Here, it's actually, sometimes when these guys are out of time, you can shove forward on the gate and it'll bring them into time as long as you hold the gate.
Oh, God.
Yes, that is terrifying.
Right.
So,
also awkward to have to shoot it, like with your thumb pressing up on that.
between these two, the 1892 and the Colt New Navy or New Armies.
You know, if it's really falling out of time that badly, I'd probably still end up sticking with our 92 here, unfortunately.
It's sadly my expert opinion that the French 1892 is better than the Colt New Army.
I don't know how fast it would fall out of time, but my concern is that if it's just that unreliable, well, it seems like just a throw of the dice, essentially, to see if it would actually even work.
I would put a caveat on it. Okay. By the time of the 1903 pattern, they were taking 38 Smith & Wesson. I believe they could handle special at that point. And they also had done major improvements to the lock work. However, still fell out of time fairly easily. They're almost always out of time when I get a hold of them.
Right.
Now, that could take a long time. So if I had one that was under 3-4 years old, I would definitely take the later Colt New Army over the French 1892.
Okay.
But an early Colt New Army or New Navy, or one that's had 20 years of age on it, which, by the way, that was in service all the way until the 50s.
Right.
Taking that.
Yeah.
That stayed in service much more rugged than these.
Just more reliable.
I know people are going to argue with me, but there's just no argument. You have fiddly screws to lose. The side plate's very hard to get off. It's press fit, no hinge. The gun itself comes out of time within 15 years of service or less. That thing stays pretty much running for 20-odd years at a time, 30-odd years at a time, easily refurbished, difficult to refurbish.
That one's already over 100 years old, and that's over a normal person's lifetime.
I mean, that one's cherry, but we've seen some beaters that are running just fine. As a matter of fact, I haven't found one of those that is out of time yet. It's not that it's impossible, it's just that they're so ruggedly made.
And you've had at least 5 examples in your hand.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I haven't found one of these in time.
Right.
So I keep having to repair these. Actually, this one's mostly in time.
Okay, so he's your revolver repair guy.
No. So that's not my business.
That's pretty much it, though, in terms of just the assessment on that guy, though. Did we have any...
You heard it from May. French 1892 better than Colt revolvers.
I mean, some. Do we have any executive producers for this show, by the way?
No, we do not.
For this episode.
I already gave some thanks to some guys that have done some particular research.
Okay.
So I think we get to just say goodbye.
Oh, well, thank you all for watching, and we hope you had a good time.
May will probably get her wish next episode.
Yeah, Ruby time.
And we've got to do the 1911, so we have to shoot a couple 1911 models. And the one,
a couple.
Yeah, and then everybody's favorite gun that's so perfect, Precious Child, that would not feed the last round.
They really hated the last round.
We how many times did we try? Like 20, 30? I mean, and I swapped the barrels and and I swapped the mags and just everything to make this stupid thing feed correctly on the last round. There's a reason they stopped using the Webley Kaufman. I have high-speed footage of the reason they stopped using the Webley Kaufman.
Yeah.
That is terrifying.
Oh, well, that's not my fault.
I experienced a new sound, and it was horrifying.
So
it was definitely your fault. You did it.
I kind of like the whistling Dixies because they're funny.
I experienced sensory-induced nausea because she lit 4 whistling Dixies at once, which is, I don't know how to explain what happened. Like this,
I feel like a warbling sound occurred.
They started distorting off of each other, and this horrible space-wrenching, nausea-inducing, psychotic fit of a sound came out. You can't. There's no way you could record that. I don't think you could record that on audio and have it come out at all because it was an experience I have never had in my life. The most horrifying, awful sound.
Aw, I gave you a new experience.
And I wouldn't say I was deafened. It was more just...
You said you were nauseated for a moment.
It's like getting hit by a flashbang. I mean, it was the most awful thing.
Walking fire. We've talked about this in our Project Lightning specials, but basically you take a machine rifle or light machine gun, put it to your hip or into a special cup on your belt, and trot across no man's land, shooting with every other step. The notion was to suppress or even kill the enemy as you approach the trench, and then...